Hello, everyone. We're into a new week, and I'm working this week on the German state of Bavaria as one of my feature areas. And it involves sorting a fairly long running set called the Embossed Arms issue, which starts in 1867 and runs all the way up to 1911. And in this set, there's a lot of shades. Most of them are only listed in Michel, but there are some fantastically expensive shade varieties of otherwise, fairly inexpensive stamps. So this leads to the use of a color key. And this brings me to the subject of today's video, which is something I should have addressed long ago, and that is the use of a color key and how one sorts for color. It's a very misunderstood topic. Um, I see all the time on Facebook groups and on social media the general opinion expressed that color keys like the Stanley Gibbons color key are basically useless because it's impossible to get an exact match for the stamp. And that displays, a profound lack of misunderstanding about what the role of a color key is and what you're supposed to use it for. Um, Color in stamp, certainly in classic philately, color is a range. All the inks back in the 1800s were all mixed by hand, and there are literally hundreds, in many cases, uh, you know, well over 100 shades of a particular color. If you would actually sit down and sort out all the minute variations, it can be well over 100. I know, as an example, one that sticks out in my mind is the 1903 Washington stamp from the U.S., the 2-cent Lake, the 2-cent Carmen. The specialists of that stamp recognize over 100 shades. It's enormous. And so, from a catalog perspective, whenever you see a particular shade being listed, it's very, very seldom the case that it is just a single shade and a single point on the continuum. Often you'll hear collectors will denigrate a stamp and say, oh, well, that's not such and such a shade. And in some cases, that's true. I mean, there are certain shades, such as, say the pigeon blood pink from the 3-cent Washington 1861 US issue, which is very, very distinct, and it is a very narrow shade. Um, that's and the sort of shade that you see it once, you never forget it. But just because that shade is an example doesn't mean that all the other listed shades are a single point on a continuum of color. They're not. They usually denote narrow to broad groups of different colors that all can represent the same basic shade. So, with that in mind, what you're looking to do when you use a color key is you're looking to get a rough match to the group. So you're looking at the tone of the color and you're comparing that to your stamp. And your stamp can be either a darker or a lighter or a more intense um, version or a less intense version of that color. But the overall tone of the color will match, and it's if it's in that group. And so when you look at a color key that way, it's much more useful. It's also important to use it correctly. So if you take your stamp, and I'll show you in a minute when I'm using it, but if you take your stamp and you try to match it exactly, um, that can paradoxically um, make it very difficult to see the differences between the shades on the key. I used to do that with my stamps. I put them under the hole and look for an exact match. And quite often, when I compared the stamp to several different swatches, I thought they were all the same. What I found is that when I relax my gaze and I hold the stamp out and the color key out from my eyes and I look with a more relaxed gaze, I can see the differences much more readily. Um, so that's something I'll try to show you in this video. So I mean that's the main point to do with color. Now the other thing that's often misunderstood in philately is various terminology that gets used in the catalogs. It can get very confusing because the colloquial definitions and descriptions are often not actually correct uses of color terms. Um, and a lot of collectors will use seemingly similar terms interchangeably to describe colors when they mean very different things. So an example of that is, dark and deep and intense. Okay, so you'll see a stamp described as, dark blue, deep blue, intense blue, and you may think that they're the same thing. They're not. Um, Light blue, pale blue are not the same at all either. Um, and then dull and bright mean different things as well. So I'll explain briefly, and I think once you understand the differences and the use and you use color terminology correctly, then what you can do is you can take the basic color group that's on the color key and you can interpolate in your head what that color will look like if you alter it using one of the color terms. And if you get, as you get more experience doing that and using that nomenclature, you can name your actual color of your stamp much more reliably. Um, Now, what you come up with will very rarely ever match what's in the catalog. And so really what needs to happen in philately, and I've advocated this for a long time, is that the specialists need to come up with a chart that takes the catalog values, or sorry, the catalog descriptions of the colors, and cross references it to an actual color key, um, so that a person using the key can match up the catalog descriptions. So to go back to the color terminology, so when you see a color described as dark, okay, dark means that there is black added to the basic color. Okay, it's usually a small amount of black, because once the amount of black added to the color is such that the black is actually visible to the naked eye, or it's actually noticeable, that's when a color goes to being blackish. So you'll see in the color key, you might see, blackish blue, blackish green. When you see those, there has been enough black added to the color that you can tell there's black in it. Okay? When a color is dark, you cannot see any black specifically. It just looks more intense. But if you compare it to an intense version of that color, or a deep version of that color, it looks clearly blackish compared to that other color. So a deep color like deep blue has to do with the saturation level of the blue. So it is the same blue in a much deeper level of saturation, but the actual tone of the blue is the same as the regular blue. Okay, likewise, pale blue will be a less saturated version of the same blue. So the overall tone of the blue shouldn't change. It just becomes less intense Okay, whereas a light color has had white added to it. And again, the amount of white that's added is not such that you can tell that there's white specifically added to the color, but it is milky in comparison to the pure color. And that is different from pale, where pale is the same tone, but just less intense than the regular fully saturated color. Okay, now a bright color is one that has a higher degree of saturation in the same chroma. So it's different again from deep. I'm not exactly sure how to describe it, but it is different. That's the one thing I would have to look up in the color books. But bright is definitely different from deep. Dull, okay, a dull color has grayscale added. And again, the addition of gray is not immediately discernible from the basic color. Let me think, what other terms are there that are often misused? I can't think of any off the top of my head. I think I've covered all of them. But I mean, that's quite. If you understand those differences and you start using those terms more correctly, then you're able to take a color that's on the color key and go, okay, if I add a little bit of black to this color, what happens to it? What does it look like? If I add a little bit of white, if I add some gray, if I increase the brightness level, or if I add grayscale to make it dull, what happens to it? And you can start you can start imagining in your head what that color would look like, and then you can match it to the stamp you have, and you can get a more accurate naming of the color. So that's an example of how you might use those terms. Now, there's other things that's useful to understand about the way the colors are named. So when you have a compound color, another mistake that's often made is to assume that, say, orange red is the same as red orange. It's not. Whenever you have a compound color, the main dominant color is the second color, with the first color being the modifying color. So orange red is a red that has an orange undertone. Okay, whereas red orange is an orange that has a reddish undertone. And in both cases, a red orange will be more orange than red, and an orange red will be more red than orange. Okay, so that's another thing to understand that will make it a lot easier for you to work with color. There are certain other things that are useful to know. For instance, another thing is warmth versus coldness of colors. So when you have a color described as warm, that refers to the addition of yellow to the color, whereas a cold color has the addition of blue. And you can think of, immediately in your mind's eye, you can think of colors that are warm as being autumn colors, and colors that are winter as being the cold colors. So for instance, purple is a warm color. It has it's a red, it has more red than blue to the color, and it it doesn't have a predominantly bluish appearance, whereas violet does. Violet is a cold color that contains more blue than red. Um, so that's useful to know, and that can help you out when you're identifying colors. Um, there's other colors you see in the catalog that can be a little difficult to interpret, but if you understand what I've talked about with the different rules of color, you can start to identify them more reliably. So, for instance, a good example of this is pink. Okay, pink versus rose. So, where this comes into play specifically is on United States 1861 issue, where you're looking at the 3-cent Washington, number 65, versus the more valuable pink, which is number 64. Okay, so the thing to understand about a color like rose is that it's not a cold color. It's a neutral color. So it can appear it's reddish. It's very light. And it can contain other colors like brown or a little bit of yellow or a little bit of um, orange or um, a little bit of blue perhaps, um, but not so much that you would notice that it would look blue. In every case, a rose does not look bluish, whereas pink does. Pink is a cold color. It always has a bluish undertone to it. It might be very, very faint, but there is always a bluish undertone to pink. And that is absolutely critical when you're looking at sorting number 65s out from 64s. 65s will not have a bluish undertone. They may be brownish, they may be slightly vermilion, they may be slightly carmine, they might have those undertones, but they will not have a bluish undertone, whereas the pinks, number 64s, always will. And that's how you sort those. Other colors like, say, bistre and ochre. Okay, that's a color. Those are colors you see in the catalog all the time. Well, what's the difference between bistre and ochre? So bistre, Scott is really horrible for using the term bistre very interchangeably to describe a lot of colors. I've noticed that actually in using the Scott Classic. It's not a very good catalog for that. But anyway, bistre is it's a brownish green. Okay, it's a greenish color. It's kind of actually what it is a brownish greenish yellow, like a dirty yellow. If you think of something as a dirty yellow that's got a greenish undertone, that's bistre. Now, if you add brown to it, it's bistre brown. But whereas it's a cold color in that it has this greenish bluish undertone to it. It's warm by the addition of the yellow, but the green part of it dominates, which makes it cool. Ochre, on the other hand, is a yellow that has a fair amount of brown in it and a fair amount of gold. And so it's a warm version of the yellow. Again, it's also, I guess, a dirty yellow, but it's dirty by the addition of brown. It's more of an autumn color than bistre, and it's completely different. It doesn't appear greenish ever. It always looks more to sort of the brown orange brown end of things, or just very, very light yellow brown. whereas Bister always has a greenish undertone. So I've already pointed out purple versus violet, and lilac. Lilac is a best way to think of lilac. It's a redder purple, but it's more. It's not reddish purple because reddish purple has a lot of red. You can almost think of lilac as being just a much lighter, much less intense purple, I guess. It's hard to describe. I think lilac is kind of its own color. But again, in the stamp catalogs, you'll see the term purple and violet used very interchangeably to describe stamps that are actually shades of lilac. And vice versa. You'll see lilac used to describe colors that are purple or violet, without a whole lot of care being taken. Another one is carmine. Okay, carmine versus scarlet versus red. So red on its own is a very neutral color. It doesn't appear orange. It doesn't appear bluish. It doesn't appear really to have any color undertone other than just its pure red form. If you think of it, think of a tomato. A tomato is probably the closest thing to a pure red. And then from there, red gets modified to produce the other colors. So carmine is a bluish red. Okay, carmine is a cold color by definition. It always has the addition of blue to the red. And if you think about blood, blood is carmine. Human blood is carmine. It's a very rich, deep red. In fact, it might almost be a crimson even, but which is a much deeper carmine. Whereas the addition of orange to red, but not enough to make it orange red. So the addition of orange to red without it being discernibly orange gives you scarlet, where it still appears red, but it's a very bright red that has a definite orangey undertone, but it doesn't appear to be a shade of orange. And then we talked about rose, what rose is. Let me think here. I think green is pretty straight. The greens are pretty straightforward. Most of those are fairly easy to discern, as are browns and blues. So really, I think I've covered most of the tricky colors. So that's some initial pointers on color. Now, what I want to do is show you what I'm actually working on here. Okay, so what I'm working on today that I'm going to show you in order to demonstrate the use of a color key is I've got the Prince or Regent Leopold set of Bavaria laid out on the table here. Now, there aren't a lot of shade varieties listed for this set, but there's quite a few on all the different values. So what I have here is my initial sort of the first value, the 3 fetting. Now, in Meikle, they list a Dunkel Orange Brown, which means dark orange brown. They list a Dunkel Sienna, and Sienna in German is, I guess, your basic brown. And then they list a Dunkel Brown with Schwarz Brown in brackets, which means that it's dark brown on their color key, but it's blackish brown. Schwarz is black in German. To the average collector, from the average collector's point of view. So what I have here, this is the actual Meikle color key. You'll see here, it's actually made by Meikle. So this is actually calibrated to their catalog listings. God, I love the Germans for this. They're so precise. What they do is they give you in the catalog their description according to this, and then in brackets they will always put the shade that most collectors would regard it as, but which is different quite often from what's in here. So if we look, we can see in here, we're going to look for Dunkel Orange Brown, Dunkel Sienna, and Dunkel Brown. So these are ochre brown, so it's probably the next page. Okay, so there's orange. There's Dunkel Orange Brown right there. Okay, Dunkel Sienna is down here. Okay, these two. And Dunkel Brown is here. So what we're working with are these three swatches here. Now, Meikle actually does give you a square that you can use to block out all the other squares. That's actually quite useful. I've never really used it, but we'll give it a whirl now, and we'll see what happens when we try to use this color key to distinguish the different shades. So if we take the Dunkel Orange Brown here and we put the square over the top so it blocks out all the other colors here, and we look, we can see that this stamp more or less matches this swatch. It's not exact, but tone-wise, it's pretty close. Now, if we try to match it against the other ones, so there's Dunkel Brown. Okay, not even close. Okay, and then Dunkel Sienna. Again, not even close, right? Like if you look here, you could see Dunkel Sienna has way more red than this color does. It's reddish and darker. Okay, so that's the Dunkel Orange Brown. That's correct. So now let's take my other sort here where what I think is Dunkel Sienna. Okay, so again, we put it up here. Nowhere close to the orange brown. We'll put it on the Dunkel Brown. Okay, that's actually pretty close. And then here to the Dunkel Sienna. Okay, that's pretty close too. I think now, see, I originally put it in with Dunkel Sienna, you'll see in a minute, because compared with this, it is redder. But I'm going to hold judgment on that one for now. So let's try this one here. Okay, that one... Yeah, that might also be Dunkel Brown. All right, let's try this one. Okay. Okay, so here, this one is redder than the Dunkel Brown. Okay, now if we try it on the Dunkel Sienna, we see that that's more or less a match. So that's Dunkel Sienna. And the other two that are here are a match with it. So that's Dunkel Sienna. Now let's take this one here. And okay, so this is actually darker than the Dunkel Brown. This is it's not a match, it's even darker. It's actually it's darker than any of the other colors here. Okay, just seeing. Yeah, it's pretty, that's red, black. So it's very much, that's actually very much a black brown. And that's actually an unlisted variety. So that means these other two here, this one here that we looked at earlier, I think is actually the dark brown. So we've got two dark browns and we've got a black brown, which isn't listed. Okay, so that demonstrates the use of it for this color. And we can do it also for another value, but I think that's good for today. But as you can see, I mean, here I was looking for an exact match using that. But if I wasn't using this blocker here, typically what I would do is just hold it up to the color and just see, you know, which one is it closest to, right? Like I could see there, that's too dark, that's close, that's much lighter and oranger, and just, you know, just move it around. I mean, I can see that this color here is a little brighter than this. Okay, but it's in the same general group. So that's good enough in terms of identifying the shade. And that's really how you're supposed to use a color key. It's not, it doesn't have to match exactly, but you're looking to get a sense of the closest color group it's a part of. And you may have to add or subtract, you know, yellow or white or grayscale or black in order to come up with a shade in your mind's eye that matches what you're looking at in the color. So anyway, there you have it. That's the use of a color key. And I hope you find that useful. Try taking your existing Stanley Gibbons color key, or if you have one of these, the Meikle color key, and go back over some stamps that you have where you are fairly confident of the shade, and then try to match it up against your color key. And I think if you do it with a more relaxed gaze and without sort of trying to get it to match exactly, you'll see that your color matches of your known color is very, very close to what is shown on the swatches. Okay, I hope that's helpful. Happy collecting. Bye for now.